let's just do a little introduction here and some housekeeping. So welcome everyone. I am thrilled to have you guys join us tonight. My name is Cindy Meserly, and I am the CEO of the Philadelphia Tri-State Chapter, and we'll be hosting tonight's webinar, which is titled When the Rheumatologist and the Patient Fight Lupus Together. Thank you to everyone from around the country who's joining us tonight, and just a few housekeeping things to get us started with this webinar. Just by nature of the webinar, all participants are muted and without video. And we did receive some questions in advance, but if you do have some additional questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A feature, which you'll see, I think typically at the bottom of your screen, it may be at the top. And we'll do our best to answer your questions during the presentation, but I do want to put one note out there. We are unable to address individual diagnosis and treatment questions on tonight's call. And similarly, if we cannot address questions that relate to whether an individual would qualify for a clinical trial based on the conversation you're going to hear from Director Caricchio. So if you do have additional questions, please reach out to your local chapter. And if it's specific to diagnosis or treatment, we do refer you back to your personal doctor for those related questions. But don't hesitate to reach out. Our email at the Philadelphia Tri-State Chapter is info@tristatelupus.org. I'm sorry, my dog was trying to get in the room and threw me. Let's start over. info@lupustristate.org. I said that backwards. But feel free to email us following the program. Also know that the our webinar is being recorded, and so you'll have access to it. So if you have to leave early or want to watch it again for some more information, you'll get that information from your local chapter, and it will also be posted on our website as well as your local chapter. So again, thank you. This is the Ask the Experts LFA Chapter Network series, and I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Dr. Roberto Caricchio. He is a rheumatologist at Temple University Health System, which is located here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Dr. Caricchio is the chief of the section of rheumatology, a medical professor, a professor of microbiology and immunology, and the director of the Temple Lupus program. Dr. Caricchio is originally from Italy, where he earned his medical degree from the Catholic University of Sacred Heart Medical School of Medicine. And Dr. Caricchio has been an active SLE researcher for at least 25 years and has been in the US for as long. He joined the Temple team back in 2006, and Dr. Caricchio has received numerous awards and grants for his work in rheumatology, and specifically for his work related to SLE. I am also thrilled to share that Dr. Caricchio is a member of the Philadelphia Tri-State Chapter Board of Directors and chairs our Medical Advisory Council. It's always an honor and a pleasure to work with Dr. Caricchio. And so, Dr. Caricchio, I'm going to turn it over to you, and thank you so much for being with us tonight and sharing this really valuable information.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you for the kind words. Let me share. Okay. So you should all see my screen.
You're good. Yep, they look great.
Which of course has the title of what we're going to do. And there are also my disclosures, which I need to disclose and so on. So you can go back since it's recorded and check on that. So I wanted to give a lecture like I do with my students, and I put here the learning objectives, which are going to be 3 today. And so the first one is the introduction to clinical trials. The second one are trials in lupus. And then I will touch just briefly about the future of clinical trials. Now, why I wanted to actually talk about clinical trials? Well, because besides being a scientist and having a lab and do some translational research, as called, I also see patients and I also participate in clinical trials. And when I talk to my patients and propose to be part of one, I have to really explain to them really on the fly in the clinic what a clinical trial is, because often patients, why should they know really what is behind the clinical trial? And so I think that this is a good chance for me to actually explain it so that you can always have it there. And if you want to go back and understand more, it's there, the explanation, and you have more information. And more information might help you decide if you want to participate into one or not. And so given that, here it is. The first thing first, definition. What is the definition of a clinical trial? Well, this is from the National Institute of Health. And so is a place that we trust. And that's what they say it is. It's a research study in which one or more human subjects are prospectively over time assigned to one or more interventions, which in our case are medications. But those can include also placebo, which we'll talk about it. And to evaluate the effects of those interventions on health-related biomedical or behavioral outcomes. So it's really a research study over time with an intervention and the effects of this intervention, what we call the outcomes. And that's how we make sure that new medications are effective. Now, behind that definition, there is a whole process, a process that actually can last up to 15 years before a medication is approved and before all the patients that fit that diagnosis can actually get. So it's a very long process. And what you see when you're talked to by your doctor or rheumatologist about clinical trial, you really see the tip of the mountain that it took to get there. So initially, there are so-called preclinical studies. Those studies are not in humans, are mostly in vitro, in cells, to make sure that these substances actually has an effect on the cell, but can be also in animal models, animals that actually have a disease that is similar to the one that we want to treat in human. For example, there are quite a number of mouse models that spontaneously develop lupus, something like that looks like lupus, and they even develop the malar rash, the butterfly rash, believe it or not. So they actually really resemble lupus, but it takes time, a long time, years, before actually it can be demonstrated that it does have an effect on that particular model. Nowadays, and with also COVID-19, we have even artificial intelligence that helps us. And in fact, for example, a medication that we use in rheumatology, and there are clinical trials in lupus, such as baricitinib, came out that it might have worked in the COVID-19 because of artificial intelligence calculations. The artificial intelligence is actually speeding up quite a bit the discovery of new potential medications. Now, after those years in which there is this attempt to demonstrate that actually this medication might be good for any disease, in our particular case, of course, lupus, then there is a request, a drug approved for human testing. That is a request that is made to the FDA to actually initiate the test in humans. And so it initiate the phase 1. Now, I just took this cartoon that divides into phases, but each phase actually has very different parts. And so there is the phase 1 in which for the first time is actually given to humans. And those are generally volunteers. Obviously, they're volunteers. They do not have the disease. This is just to test that it's not harmful in humans. And there are very little doses given initially and then higher and higher until the dose that we know is going to work in the disease. And that is the phase 1. The late phase 1, phase 1B so-called, and so on, can be actually with patients who have the disease, but a handful, very few. If everything goes well, if the toxicity is acceptable, if the target is actually reached with the mechanism that we are thinking that the medication works by, then there is the phase 2. Now, the phase 2, it is for patients with that particular disease, for example, with lupus. And what it does is with sometimes 50 each group of lupus patients, it will explore if actually does have some effects and is also safe for lupus patients. And then finally, there is the phase 3, which is the last phase before approval, in which hundreds of patients, sometimes thousands of patients are enrolled in the clinical trial. And at that point, given the number of these patients, then it's really looked at, is it working? Is it better than what we have? And is it safe? If the phase 3 actually concludes that it's successful, that it's one, safe, because safety first, and then is effective, meaning that compared to what the patients in the placebo are taking, this medication has a better result, then there is a submission to the FDA for approval. Now, keep in mind that over 95%, if not more, of all the medications that start to this point don't make it to the phase 3. They stop either preclinical or phase 1 or phase 2. The vast majority of medications that are tried in clinical trials do not make it to the phase 3, to the largest phase, to demonstrate that it works, because the vast majority fails to demonstrate an activity. In fact, one really medication out of 100 that are placed in a clinical trial will eventually get FDA approval. So that's how tough it is to demonstrate that something is better and it works. After the FDA approval, when patients start to actually get it because there is an approval, actually it's not over. There is the last phase, the phase 4, the phase after the approval, in which at this point, many patients will get it in a real life situation, because the clinical trial is very well controlled situation, and we'll go over that and see if actually there is something that the thousands of patients that had it during the clinical trial missed it. Maybe there is more effect for something else, as for medications in lupus actually recently, or maybe there is something that came out after the approval, because of many more thousand patients have taken the medication, and maybe a new side effect that we were not aware of, or after years of taking it, something else comes up. So there is also an investigation after. So it's a very complicated point. And up to the FDA approval, it can take up to 15 years, 15 years, and also up to $3 billion, a billions with a B. So it's very expensive proposition. Now, how design a clinical trial? Now, a clinical trial is pretty much what you're looking at. It's very standard. There is the first phase, which is the screening phase, and then the so-called randomization. And then there are two parts. One half of the patients will be given the medication, the other half the placebo, which we'll go back later. And while the screening and randomization can last up to 45 days, the trial itself can last up from 1 to 4 years. So it could be quite a long term, especially nowadays, because the companies really want to demonstrate that it works over time and not just for a short period of time, which is very important. So this is a scheme of a very classic clinical trial design, 2 arms. Now let's see the first thing. Now, before you get screened, you have to agree that that's what you want to do. And the process is when it's given to you what's called informed consent. Now, the informed consent is a document that is given to you, and which should contain the items that I listed here. The informed consent is something that is made and updated over time by the Food and Drug Administration. It is really a document that is, the intent is to protect the patient. So let's see briefly what actually entails. And every informed consent in every trial should contain those items. For example, it has to be stated that it's actually research. And so it is experimental. And how long it's going to last, why it is going to do, what is the logic behind this clinical trial, why this particular medication. It has to list the risks that are involved as far as the company knows, and if there is anything that the company can anticipate about the risks, and of course the benefits. What are the benefits of this particular trial? And if you don't want to enroll, is there any alternative that you can get? That has to be listed and specified that there is a protection for your information. So confidentiality is extremely important in a clinical trial, and that has to be written, spelled out correctly, that nobody will have access to your information, and only authorized personnel. If you get injured during the trial related to the medication that you're being given, then there has to be spelled that the treatment will be given to you for free. And there will be also some compensation, especially if there is more than so-called minimal risk in the trial. So all these elements has to be well spelled out. And there should be also a contact for you, somebody that you can call anytime, any day, 24/7 to actually ask questions or report problems and so on. And finally, that obviously it is a voluntary enrollment. And so that you decide, if you decide not to go ahead, and if you decide that once you went ahead and enrolled, you want to stop it, it is your absolute right. And there will be no elimination of benefits or penalties or loss in any way or shape if you decide so. So that's why the informed consent is a document that eventually you will sign if you want to enroll, that protects you from the clinical trials or from whatever will happen. So very important part. Once you sign the informed consent, and we all agree that we should go ahead, then there is the screening part. The screening part, it's complex and it is in part time consuming. But what I listed here is an example. The most important part of the screening process is what's called inclusion and exclusion criteria. And by that means, do you fit what we are looking for? And if you do fit what we're looking for in terms of disease and type of patient, do you have anything that might impact the results at this point or the outcome? So they're called inclusion criteria. Generally, when the list of inclusion criteria they have to be met, all of them. And I listed a few here. For example, the individual has to be of at least 18 years of age or more. There has to have a diagnosis of lupus. And it's not enough that your rheumatologist told you about, oh, you have lupus. No, there is a way to diagnose in a standardized manner. And there are criteria for that. And I listed them here, the name of it. In our program, for example, we validate so-called all the lupus patients by having them met all those criteria. So we can really truly say, okay, they have lupus. And the reason why there are those criteria, so that actually when the patients are enrolled in clinical trials for lupus, for example, we know exactly that every patient really is a patient with lupus, because sometimes lupus can be incomplete, so-called, or a type of lupus that maybe is more of another condition rather than lupus itself. But having those criteria really group patients into these diagnoses. Often, clinical trials are looking for individuals with lupus that have active disease and they are not responding to the current treatment, so that they can add their own new medication and demonstrate that actually works. And often also, clinical trials require patients to be on a medication that unfortunately at that time is not working because the lupus is still active, but stable in terms of dosage. Because, for example, if you are a patient that in which the dose of your prednisone, for example, has been doubled in the last 2 weeks, and so the amount is quite high, then it's very difficult if you get enrolled into a clinical trial, if it is the high dose of steroids that are actually helping, or the medication that you are in the clinical trial. And fortunately and unfortunately, we know that steroids do work in lupus, but they also do have serious side effects. And so all those criteria have to be all met. The exclusion criteria instead, as I mentioned, situations in which either it is too risky for the patient or might have an impact on the results. It's enough that only one is actually met. For example, if a patient is pregnant, cannot be enrolled in most circumstances because being a medication that has not been used so far on a large scale, we really don't know if it's safe in pregnancy or not. Of course, we don't want to hurt anybody. And so the patients, pregnant patients, are generally excluded. Other classic circumstances are when there is a very severe lupus kidney disease and active. Very often, they are excluded as much as patients are excluded if they have CNS lupus. And those are both circumstances in which the patients have very severe manifestations of lupus. And unless the clinical trial is really targeted to those two serious manifestations, if the patient has it, usually is excluded because the intervention in those particular two situations is much more intense, much more aggressive, And generally, those are not the trials. Again, unless the trial itself is for lupus nephritis, which we have quite a few. So in that case, you must have lupus nephritis. So, but often they are ruled out. And of course, we don't want to enroll patients that have active infections because most of the time the medications for lupus diminish the capacity to fight infections. And so we certainly don't want to make matters worse at the time in which we need to treat the patient. So those are examples, but those are very typical examples of, in lupus especially, of what type of patients are generally enrolled. So patients who have an active disease and or a specific organ in involvement. Now, the word here, active lupus disease, sounds pretty simple, just active lupus disease. But if you look at how nowadays is actually measured the activity, it is quite complicated, very complicated. We investigators have to take hours of actual training online to be certified in using those systems, because that's how complicated it has become the way that we understand if a medication is working or not in clinical trials. And what I listed here are the most classic examples that are used in clinical trials. The SRI-4, the BICLA, the CLASI. Some are specific for the skin, for example, CLASI, which stands for cutaneous lupus. Others are a composite of a number of disease activity indexes, and they're very complicated, as well as the BICLA. The BILAG, for example, this particular one takes hours of training online and certification. And those on the right, there are other ways of investigating and measuring, having a number at the end of disease activity, so that eventually the intervention, the medication can show that can decrease this activity. And eventually, though, there is also me and you. There is the patient feelings and the rheumatologist feeling. By that, I mean, in the last few years, many, and those are the most classic, many forms and many indexes that deal with the patient itself. So what the patient can do, what the impact of the disease activity is having of the activities during the day of that particular patient. So, for example, the FACIT-F, Functional Assessment of Chronic Illness Therapy Fatigue, is a very much used one, because eventually, yes, we can look at all these very complex measurements in which we are going to do mathematical formulas of the number of joints that are swollen, or the skin, how much skin there is involved. But we also need to know that the actual patient, the patient is also feeling better after getting this medication. And that's also an important, very important point. And eventually, there is also what the physician that is taking care of that patient thinks. And it's called physician global assessment, such as, do I think that this patient is doing better or not? And, you know, after you get to see thousands of lupus patients, eventually you get, you develop a sense of how the patient is doing. And apparently that very sense correlates quite well, it matches quite well quite a few of those indexes. So eventually there is also a human component, such as how the patient is feeling and what the physician is actually thinking about that patient. Now, the first day, after you get screened, after you meet the criteria, the patient meets the criteria of inclusion and none of the exclusion criteria, then there will be the day one, the day in which you will be, or the patient will be randomized, meaning given one or the other medication. And the visit number one can be intense because there is a lot of those personal information given, the physical exam, the blood drawn to initiate, before initiating therapy, and all the questionnaires that deal with your activity of daily living, making sure that actually the disease is active at that point. And as I mentioned, a number of laboratory tests which will not just assess how your kidney is doing, your liver is doing, your lupus in general is doing, but also at the genetic level, at the expression of the genes in this particular lupus patient. And in fact, this is very important. In the last decade or so, clinical trials not only have demonstrated either failing or succeeding in a new medication, but have also gathered such an enormous amount of information about lupus. They spend a significant amount of resources, not just to give the medication, but also to understand, one, that particular lupus patient, but also how that particular medication is working. And that has increased tremendously the understanding that we have of disease. So there is a lot of science and understanding that also is providing clinical trials are providing. In fact, the cost of each individual in a clinical trial can get pretty significant, and it can go up to $100,000 and more per patient. So it's a very, very expensive approach, but again, we learn a lot no matter what. And so the first day can be long. It is generally a few hours, and the patient should be told about that, because it's a complicated process, and all the dots needs to be placed and the T needs to be crossed. And the day pass by, you qualify again, and then there is the randomization, which means that one patient either gets the medicine or the placebo, which will look quite identical. Now, a randomization, it is a process that goes by random. So if you flip a coin 5 times, you might get 5 heads or 5 tails. But if you flip a coin 100 times, you will generally get 50 tails and 50 heads. And that's how randomization works. So half of the patient overall will take the medicine and the other half the placebo. But why do we need the placebo? And what it is the placebo? Well, it's quite an important point. So the definition of placebo is a substance that has no therapeutic effect used as a control in testing new drugs. That is the placebo. So that has no effect. We know it's a sugar pill. Actually, there is no sugar there, because otherwise your sugar would go up in your blood. So it shouldn't do anything. But what is important is its effect, even though it doesn't do anything. So a beneficial effect which cannot be attributed to the properties of the placebo itself, and must therefore be due to the patient's belief in that treatment. So if I tell you with all my heart and with a smile that this pill is good for you, well, chances are that you will feel better even if there is nothing there. And if I'm told by one of my colleagues with full heart and with a smile that that pill is good for me, I will feel good even before getting it, because we are all humans, and that's what the effect is. And that's why we need the placebo part. Indeed, if you look at this, is the same scheme that I showed you. So when the patients get randomized, either toward the placebo or the randomization, and then there will be a comparison with response to therapy, well, up to 20% will respond to therapy, but they are in the placebo arm. They didn't get it, but yet there will be, and this is an example, there will be a significant portion of patients who will feel better. And that is why there is a threshold by which the placebo needs to be met. So the medication that we are giving in a clinical trial has to be better than the placebo, because that's how powerful it is. I wish we could use just the placebo to treat, but it doesn't work all the time. It works mostly in clinical trials. But that's why we need to have an arm in which they do not take the medication. To complicate things nowadays is that most clinical trials in lupus, not only they have to account for the placebo, but they also have to account that the medication has to be better than what they are already getting. So most of the time, clinical trials in lupus, they do not take away medications by which the patient is taking, but actually the medications are added on top or what they're already taking. And generally, patients are taking something like a little bit of prednisone, the hydroxychloroquine. Sometimes they're taking methotrexate for Imuran, azathioprine, or even mycophenolate. So they're already taking something. Well, that medication has to be on top of that and be better than the placebo plus what they're taking. So that's how it is and how difficult it is to show that the medication works, to the point that when in lupus, the medication is shown that it works, it has to be pretty good. And so what do we have to minimize the placebo effect? Well, the gold standard is called randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial. That is the best that we have to minimize it. And basically is when neither the physician nor the patient actually know what they're getting or what they're giving. Only one person knows, and that is most likely the pharmacist, the research pharmacist somewhere in the basement of the hospital, if it's a hospital-based pharmacy, who's actually randomizing based on the ID of the patient. So there's only somebody who knows downstairs, and then of course the main pharmaceutical company eventually, when they will open the numbers and make their calculation. Otherwise, I don't know, and the patient doesn't know, so that I cannot really say anything outside of thank you for doing this and for helping every lupus patient. But certainly, I don't know what you're taking, and the patient in there. And it seems to work to some extent, but that is the gold standard. The medication, or the placebo, there are variety of modalities. Those are the typical of lupus patients, for example. For lupus patients, they can be by mouth, they can be intravenous, or subcutaneous, or even transdermal with the band. And you can look as close as you want to the pill. You won't be able to identify what if it is a placebo or the actual medicine, because they are made exactly the same. And if there is a problem with the color, because maybe intravenous the bottle changes color, then the bottle itself will be black or darkened in a way that nobody can see the color. So they're all very, even the tubing, they're very careful, because otherwise, if you know you're not getting it, well, you could be very disappointed, or if you know you're getting there, okay, I'm good, I can continue. So it's very important. It's all very important. It'd be completely masked, you won't be able to, or the physician, or anybody else. And so at the end, we need to look at the outcome. So how, is this medication better or not, that what the patient is already taken or what is already available to the patient? Generally speaking, in lupus in particular, the clinical trials are organized into weeks. So, for example, this is the visit 1 that I mentioned, and week 0 when the patient will start, which of course there will be a lot of things to do: questionnaires, exams, physical exam, lab work, and then generally after 4 weeks, after a month, there will be a monthly visit in which every month there will be something different to do. Of course, it's given some flexibility to the patient, plus minus 7 days generally, and those intermediary visits, there will be less to do. Often, for example, here, the complete exam is going to be every 6 months or so, but the focus physical exam is actually monthly. And sometimes the focus physical, for example, is for joint arthritis, so swelling of the joints, the count of the joints, or perhaps urine analysis for kidney disease clinical trials, and so on. And then every now and then, for example, every 6 months in this particular case, this is an example, but that is pretty typical example. On the month 6, there will be again everything done, so that actually there can be a time interval in which there can be differences can be truly measured. And then at the end of the trial, which often lasts 12 months, and then there is the so-called long-term extension, which can last up to 2 years. So in which the patient continues either the placebo or the interventional product or the medication to demonstrate that the medication works for a long time rather than for a short period of time. And there are a number of ways to facilitate the patient's time commitment with the offer of rides to the patient. And of course, the patient will be reimbursed of expenses such as traveling and meals, because obviously the patient has to travel sometimes and has to eat. And those are other tests that I wanted to list because it's a very typical lupus clinical trial disorder. So again, the lab work is going to be done every now and then, of course, regularly. And for example, here, the laboratory tests for the disease activity is actually done monthly, albeit at a lower amount of blood. Of course, every month will be checked for everything that has happened to you. And finally, this is an example of a trial, which is actually the belimumab one, the first one that then eventually was approved for lupus, the Belista. So see, they started with almost 1,400 patients, and this was the last phase, the phase 3 that I mentioned. But only a little bit more than 800 actually ended up being randomized. And the reasons were for screening so-called failure, which I really don't like that word, but we use it. It looks like somebody has failed. Well, nobody has failed here, but it is used in the industry. And there are many reasons. For example, did not meet inclusion criteria. So maybe, and it is quite a bit, almost 300. Maybe because the disease was not active. Maybe because actually they didn't have a full, complete lupus, and or they had medications recently changed. So there are a variety of reasons, but 130 had the exclusion criteria. So there are quite a few, and so on. So see, when you screened, basically you had to expect that a third will not be able to actually be enrolled. In this particular case, quite a few, or 40%. And now, and out of those 800, eventually they were split into 3 groups, randomized into the placebo group, into the 1 dose of belimumab and another dose of belimumab. And eventually they were able to analyze a little bit less than 200 for each group, and they showed significant difference. And then eventually the FDA approved it. And we've been using belimumab since then, which is the only one approved in 50 years. It's not bad. But there will be more next year, most likely. So, you know, so that's actually quite a good news. So again, out of 1,300, eventually 600, actually less than 600 finished the trial. So it's a long journey, but it's worth every moment, because eventually the patients have more options and possibly better options. So thank you for all these patients that actually participated. So what are the apps of clinical trials? Well, you certainly get to contribute to the development of better treatments. So you're not doing this just for yourself, but you're doing this for every single lupus patient, because if that medication works, then it's because of you that actually can be given to everybody else. You get to be evaluated quite often by your rheumatologist, monthly. So that's not bad. It doesn't happen very often. So you get to be checked, and everything that happens is going to be taken into consideration. So there is quite an attention to yourself. And so with that comes also the regular follow-ups, which are much more intense. Of course, most likely you've been seen by your rheumatologist maybe 3 times a year or 4 times a year. In this case, you get seen 12 times a year. And of course, thanks to your effort, there is going to be a better understanding of the disease, because, as I mentioned before, those clinical trials, they don't just check if the medication works because the patient no longer has swollen joints or a rash or kidney disease, but they also incorporate an enormous amount of investigation into the disease itself, so that one day we can actually cure it. So there is all accumulation of information that is going to be there and able to analyze later on. And at this point, we're talking about tens of thousands of lupus patients. So that's a good app. The doubts. Well, there is the blood drawing. Some people, definitely patients don't like it. And as I tell always my patients, there should be something wrong if you like to be blood drawn all the time. But nobody likes needles. And so that might be a bit of a downside, although it's only once a month, but it is for now the standard. And of course, it's a time commitment and consuming, because you'll have to come once a month. Now, there are visits in which they only last half an hour, and then every 6 months they might last 2 hours. And then it depends also on the intervention. Some are pills, so that's fine, but some are infusions, and so you might actually, the infusion might last 2 hours. So that is actually 2 hours in which you have to stay there. Most of the time, the visit will be combined with the infusion. At least that's how I organize. And there might be some anxiety for some, because you really don't know if you're getting the placebo or the interventional product, because that's how the double-blind placebo trial is organized, to minimize the placebo. But that, I understand, can give some anxiety. And having said that, I hope I gave a good overview of the complexity of the clinical trials, and specifically in lupus. And I also hope that I give you also a sense that it is a very important proposition, but that also can be manageable. And so if you decide to enroll in one, where do I find one? Where do you find one? How can you approach a clinical trial and see if you can be a participant? Well, certainly there are 3 major modalities. The first one is to ask your rheumatologist. Your rheumatologist should be aware of clinical trials in lupus, or can find out for you. That would be the first approach. The second, certainly, the foundations, local or national. The LFA does have, and the local LFA they do have at least a website where you can go and check where clinical trials are available in your area. And then finally, there is a website, clinicaltrial.gov, which actually contains every single trial on the planet, at least the majority of trials that are ongoing in the world. And it's something that is searchable by anybody. You just have to go to clinicaltrials.gov, and it's the search engine. Now, this is, I took a snapshot yesterday, and as of yesterday, there were almost 360,000 research studies in the world, and between United States, the 50 states, and 219 countries. Now, they are not necessarily all with a medication. There are many forms of clinical trials, but you can certainly here, in a find the study, search the condition that you want, in our particular case, lupus, and maybe nephritis or skin, and even you can divide them with by the countries. And so I made a search for you in which I just searched lupus with in the United States with the characteristic of being active, either not recruiting or recruiting yet. And 67 came up, and you can click on each one of them to have the specific. And you can see also the location, and there should be the principal investigator or a phone number, and the various locations nearby you live that actually are enrolling, the so-called site of the clinical trials. So this is the most comprehensive way of searching for a clinical trial on your disease, on a specific condition, and a site that is recruiting around your area. And you can also actually on clinicaltrials.gov, you can map the various clinical trial. In this particular case is the map of the lupus clinical trial in the world. There are 67 in the United States, 52 in Europe, 39 in China, for example, and 24 in Russia, and so on. Well, in Russia, in Russia, yes, and so on. It's a little bit more Russia here, but so you can see that there is a tremendous emphasis on having clinical trials and better treatments in lupus. And I selected those clinical trials that are actually interventional, which means that there is actually a medication that is given to patients, of course, and the placebo. So there is quite a bit going on in lupus and clinical trials to find better treatments for sure. Now, I did mention that I would have touched just briefly on the future of clinical trials. Now, the examples that I showed, the example that I showed of a clinical trial did require for you to come and go through a series of questionnaires that you would have answered, and for us, a series of examinations that would have helped us create those activity indexes that I show to you, and then eventually blood drawing and various tests that would have told us if you were active or not, and then how those changes could have occurred over time, over the period of a year or more. Now, COVID-19 has pushed the entire industry toward a different direction. Now, when we were initially in the pandemic at the end of March, beginning of April, when the country and most of the country went into lockdown, the vast majority, if not all, clinical trials, at least in lupus, were placed on hold. We could not recruit anymore. And that has been going on for months. There are a few clinical trials that are actually now back up and running because we have, as you know, a second wave. And so many places or many patients are unwilling to actually enroll right now, and they are scared at this point. So the thoughts were, well, how can we continue to do this? Because we cannot just stop and wait forever. And so there are already quite few examples in which there is the so-called approach of a virtual clinical trial, which is quite a fancy word, but it does mean what it states, because it is all remote. I'm pretty sure that many of you are having televisits with your video encounters with your rheumatologist. We at Temple are possibly at least 60% telemedicine, if not more, although at some point we need to see the patients because they want to be seen because the joints hurt and we need to inject and so on, or the rashes and so on. But virtual medicine, it is one of the answers, along with technology, for rendering the clinical trials more flexible for patients. And so this is a nice cartoon which explains of this. So the patient is at the center. It's called the center patient, patient-centered, but the patient is at home. Is not at the hospital setting or the outpatient office. It's at home with a group of individuals, including the principal investigator, which can reach the patient remotely by video chatting or video encounters. And there is the nurse, there is the PI, and there is also associated other forms of research professionals that can help the patient achieve what needs to be done to be followed in a clinical trial. Now, why this is possible? This is possible because of technology. And the technology here illustrated is cartoonish, but very, very informative. For example, if there are behavioral trials, then a video camera can certainly capture the behavior and render what needs to be observed. But if the patient is in a clinical trial, for example, in lupus for clinic skin rashes or joint swelling, then a picture with a certain standardized modality can actually replace part of the physical exam. And finally, the blood drawing that needs to be done on a regular basis. Now technology allows to actually, with a single drop, have similar information that it would be from a blood drawing. So, and that one can be just, and it can be stored at room temperature. So one can put it in a box and then just ship it, or ship it to the company, but also possibly having the results directly into a device, and then send this information through his or her mobile device to the center where the data are analyzed. So you can picture that the patient might have a first encounter with the rheumatologist and the team that is going to take care of her during the clinical trial, but from there on, you can be sitting at home or doing her things, working or going to grocery, and then go back home with flexibility during the day. And then when the day comes of the virtual visit, then it can be taken in the evening, in the morning. So there is more flexibility, and the blood work can be just shipped or entered into a device and transmitted as a result. So it's actually quite a different world. And COVID-19, fortunately and obviously very unfortunately, has pushed toward, has accelerated the implementation of this type of clinical trials, which we see more and more often. And on the other hand, they also might cost less, because the transportation that the patient needs to come, the exam, the time that is spent in the clinic. So eventually, not only can be optimal for the patient, but can actually save money. And those saved money can actually go into more clinical trials. And so I hope that we are almost on time. Perfect. But I hope that I gave you, when you see something like this, you understand what a clinical trial is. You have a better understanding of the various phases, and then to think more seriously about participating into one, or at least you know better now. And so, in conclusions, I would say that the final thoughts are two for me. First of all, is that clinical trials save lives and gives us now quite a better understanding, but also better options for the patients. But ultimately, those clinical trials are definitely based on the generosity of patients that are willing to participate. And so for that, I certainly thank you very much. And so I conclude with that, with my cartoon that I really like from an old New Yorker, in which this is the dream of every lupologist, and that goes by, your grandma and I have decided to live together. And so the hope is that even though the patient with lupus, with the wolf, has the wolf, and we cannot truly get rid of it, well, at least we can make them live happily for a very, 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 very long time. With that, I thank you, and I take questions if any.
Oh my gosh, thank you. I love that cartoon. And I first looked at it and I was like, wait a minute. And then I had to think about it for a minute, and then I really got it. But such incredible information. I mean, the value of clinical trials, Dr. Caricchio, is just incredible. A couple of questions that we've kind of, that I have come up with as your presentation, and points of clarification. When you talked about the requirements of, the base requirements of participating in a clinical trial, you talked about being on a stable lupus treatment. Can you clarify for everybody, does your treatment typically change on the new medication, the possible treatment that you're going on when you're involved in clinical trial, or you stay on your current regimen and it's an add-on?
Yes, very important point. It's an add-on. The treatment of the patient does not change. Whatever the patient was on at that moment in time, he will stay on. There will be only the addition either of the medication or the placebo. Sometimes, actually more often than not, an increase, a briefly temporary increase of the dose of prednisone can be allowed. Generally no more than 40 at times 60 milligrams of prednisone, sometimes just for a few days, because the patient might have a mild flare, but no more than that. And generally speaking, those allowance, so to speak, it is within the first 3 to 6 months. After that, it's not allowed. And by that doesn't mean that the patient doesn't get treated. If the patient has a flare, then it will be examined, and the discussion with the rheumatologist will be taken, and the patient might just decide not to continue, but to get another intervention.
So when they go into a flare, if there's a major intervention, hospitalization, and we're talking probably some significant medications, that could potentially disqualify them from the rest of the trial. Is that true?
Yes, but disqualification is not exactly so what it is that the patient did not respond to the treatment. And that is taken into consideration, because many patients, even though they don't finish the time of the trial, If they enroll for up to, let's say, 8 months, and then the trial is 12, but at the 8th month, they had a significant flare, that still counts and is going to be analyzed because it tells us, especially if the patient, well, in both ways, even if the patient had a placebo or the medication, it's still informative. But nevertheless, if the patient has a significant flare, it will be treated with other options.
Sure, and that's a good reminder that even failure is good information for us because we still have so much to learn about lupus and treatments and causes and cures that failure tells us a little bit more than we didn't know before.
Correct. Either way, we do get information, and that particular patient will also have given blood for all sorts of markers that will tell us why the patient eventually had a flare. So there is always to learn.
Yeah, very good point. So in this COVID world that we're in, as you brought up, one of the concerns, of course, everybody is just the fastness, like the speed of which the COVID vaccine has come up. You talked about, a typical, phase 1 to phase 4 is upwards of 15 years, right? We've just come out with a vaccine in a very short period of time. Does that impede? How does that talk about the legitimacy, the value of the vaccine that's coming out for COVID-19, and how lupus patients should be really dealing with that, and who should they talk to about getting it?
Yeah, those are all obviously important questions that lupus patients are wondering all the time. I would say that for now, try to get the information from your rheumatologist, or nowadays, if you read the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, they're so scientific that they will tell you that too. But besides that, I wouldn't recommend. But nevertheless, they do a pretty good job. So for now, the CDC has decided, and personally, I think rightly, that the first wave of vaccines will go to the front, the physicians and all the staffing and all the supporting stuff around all these healthcare providers who work in the COVID-19 units. So this is the first way that we get the vaccines, and then the physicians and every healthcare worker, not just physicians, that are working in emergency rooms. After that, there will be individuals at greater risk of death, which are those individuals in nursing homes, elderly nursing homes. Clearly, over 90% of the individuals that unfortunately died of COVID-19 in the United States are actually individuals over 70. Which is very unfortunate. And actually, as of today, COVID-19 is the #1 killer, has surpassed already cardiovascular disease, which is mind-blowing in the United States. For what concerns immunosuppressed individuals and for what concerns lupus, at this point, no foundation or no entity such as the American College of Rheumatology is releasing recommendations. And I'm actually participating into that in a way because we really don't know yet. Now, given the history of those vaccines, given the modality of the technology in those vaccines, there shouldn't be anything that is contraindicated for lupus patients because they are not live vaccines or attenuated vaccines, which are the two forms that lupus patients should stay away from. Because of their immunosuppression. Outside of those, there is really no indication that there's no contraindication as of yet. This is based on really scientific rationale. It is not really based on experience because we have zero experience with these vaccines before, right? But there are hundreds of thousands of people now already vaccinated. And autoimmunity is not one of the side effects that is coming out of those vaccines. So I think I want to be very cautious about it, but quite optimistically cautious about it. I think lupus patients, eventually, if they have a stable disease and are on a stable regimen of their medications, I really don't see why they shouldn't get vaccinated.
Nice, thank you. So you also referenced that in clinical trials, if you had CNS involvement or very severe lupus, they don't typically qualify for a clinical trial of that sort. So how do we get those aspects of lupus and the very severe disease states? How do we get those studied? Where does that information come from so that we do learn more about it?
Yes, that's very important point, very important question. So for what concerns lupus nephritis, it's easier to answer to lupus nephritis. First of all, the design of the trials has improved as such that we can do trials in active lupus nephritis. Also because we know that the medications we have right now, they do have some effect. They are not good by any stretch of imagination. We need far better options, but at least we know that we are doing a little bit with what we have. So at least we can design trials in which we give the medications we have, the options we have. We wait a few months, we see if the patient is not responding. And if he's not responding, we can add on the new medication. Okay, so either the new medication or the placebo. If after a few months is not working, then we can do the crossover, so-called. So we give actually the medication to the patient and see if that actually has worked. So do you have ways in which we can help the patient nevertheless? When it comes to CNS lupus, that is arguably the most severe manifestation that we have in lupus. It can be lethal, it can be life-threatening, it requires hospitalization, sometimes requires intubation. So those trials are extremely difficult to design, and there is also ethical issues to consider. To give a placebo to an individual who has very, very severe manifestations of lupus, it's very difficult. So it's very difficult. So we just don't. We just learn by other modalities that are not the gold standard, so-called, which is case series. So we basically treat the patients with certain modality, knowingly what we are giving to the patient, and then look at the results. But that is very different from a double-blind placebo trial. That is why CNS lupus, everything we give in CNS lupus is so-called off-label. So there is no FDA-approved medication that we have for CNS lupus. It's a very important question that unfortunately I don't have a very strong answer because it's a very difficult situation.
Sure. And can you, I think we got one more time for one more question. Can you speak to the value as an active researcher yourself? You're involved in so many different projects and have been for quite some time. But the value of a patient registry to you as a researcher and to the research community in general?
It is as valuable as the clinical trials. We cannot enroll every patient in clinical trials, but having lupus registries allows many more people to actually understand, investigate, and understand lupus, because registries are over time. So it's a much larger number of individuals with lupus who share their clinical information and their medications, and also very often blood samples, specimens. So investigators around the country can actually put together all these thousands of patients and investigate, analyze their blood samples or even their clinical data. Of course, everything blinded, anonymized, but nevertheless a group of lupus patients, and come up with a hypothesis and actual intervention on those patients. And the only way to do so is via registries because of the number of patients that are in a registry. Absolutely. It is as valuable as a clinical trial.
So I have to admit that was a little bit of a setup question, because I did put in the chat for everybody, the Lupus Foundation has they revised our current registry and renamed it, rebranded it, and it's called RAY, R-A-Y, Research Accelerated by You. And not only is it just a patient registry, not just a patient registry, it offers a tool for, as people complete it, to identify to the individual participant where they might qualify for a clinical trial in their area. So it's a great asset to really marrying the information, and it's also a tool that they can use in sharing information with their physician of keeping track of symptoms and ongoing. So it's more than just a one-time registry. It's really fascinating. So I encourage people to check it out because, like you said, it's an incredible tool, and researchers like yourself are clamoring for this information because, like you said, not everybody can participate in a clinical trial, but the data is super valuable. So I would say, I just think we could go on this topic for a very long time, and I so appreciate your time, Dr. Caricchio, but I think we'll wrap it up here.
Of course.
I will thank everybody who joined us today and stayed through. There'll be a recording that will come out. If you have additional questions, you can reach us at info@lupustristate.org or reach out to your home chapter. And again, Dr. C, thank you so much. Happy holidays. I wish you stay safe, stay well, and we'll talk soon. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.
Bye-bye.